There exists a certain kind of soul that feels too deeply, that sees too much, and that carries an invisible weight most will never understand. This soul doesn't just listen, it absorbs. It doesn't simply comfort, it transforms. It's the empath, the quiet healer of emotional wounds they didn't create, the mirror that reflects humanity's hidden suffering, yet beneath their gentleness lies a silent story of endurance. A story of how much they've carried silently for far too long. An empath's life begins with sensitivity that feels both like a gift and a curse. They sense shifts in energy before words are spoken. They can walk into a room and immediately feel what others are hiding. Where most people hear tone, the empath hears pain. Where others see behavior, they perceive motives. Their awareness is not just emotional, it's energetic, instinctive, cellular. They live in a world where everything vibrates with meaning, and every vibration leaves an imprint upon their inner world. Because of this, the empath often becomes a vessel for other people's unresolved emotions. They draw in sorrow like oxygen. They absorb anger and confusion as if it were their duty to balance the chaos around them. They are natural harmonizers, quietly repairing the unseen fractures in the emotional atmosphere. But this gift comes with an unspoken cost, the erosion of their own peace. Every moment of comfort they give to others is often drawn from their own emotional reserves. They become containers for pain that isn't theirs, healers who forget to heal themselves. Over time, this silent absorption becomes their normal state of being. They learn to smile while feeling the heaviness of 10 different emotions that don't belong to them. They learn to listen while their own heartache is for a moment of rest. They learn to forgive, not because it's easy, but because they understand too much. And when others break them, they rationalize it as compassion. They believe that love means staying, that loyalty means absorbing, that peace means silence. But the empath's silence is not emptiness, it's suppression. Beneath their calm demeanor lies a storm of unspoken pain. They've been the emotional sponge for lovers who could not love, friends who could not listen, families that could not see them. They have carried generations of trauma, absorbing the emotional debris of others while forgetting that they too deserve space to breathe. The world mistakes their stillness for strength, but it is often exhaustion, an exhaustion so deep that even rest feels like work. Yet, even in their fatigue, the empath continues to give. They think that if they just love harder, understand deeper, or forgive faster, things will change. They believe that their compassion can rewrite the wounds of those who refuse to face their own reflection. And for a while, it works. People feel better in their presence. The narcissist feels powerful, the broken feel comforted, the angry feel understood. The empath becomes the emotional sanctuary for everyone except themselves. This pattern continues until one day the empath begins to feel hollow. They notice that their laughter no longer feels authentic. They begin to feel resentment toward the very people they've tried to save. Their body starts to ache with invisible tension. Their mind becomes foggy from carrying too much emotion that was never processed. The silent healer begins to crack. They start to realize that what they thought was love was often manipulation, that what they called understanding was sometimes exploitation, and that the peace they tried to maintain was built on their own suppression. The empath's awakening begins quietly. It's not loud or dramatic. It's a whisper that says, "You cannot carry this anymore. It's a subtle recognition that the pain they've been feeling is not all theirs, that the heaviness in their chest belongs to 1,000 others who have unloaded their emotional burdens onto them. This realization doesn't make them bitter. It makes them conscious. And consciousness is the first form of freedom. They start to step back, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. They begin to observe rather than absorb, to witness pain without making it their responsibility. They start to see the hidden exchange that has always taken place. The empath gives energy, others take it. The empath offers light, others use it to illuminate their own shadows. This awareness changes everything. But awareness also brings grief. The empath mourns the years they spent being strong for others. They grieve for the version of themselves that thought love meant carrying everyone's pain. They realize that their silence was not peace, it was survival. They had been conditioned to heal what hurt them, to understand what broke them, to rationalize what exploited them. And now, they are finally learning to release what was never theirs to hold. The silent absorption of pain turns into the conscious transmutation of energy. Instead of letting others' emotions bury them, they begin to alchemize them. They learn to let the pain pass through instead of letting it stay. They learn that compassion without boundaries is self-destruction disguised as virtue. They understand that true empathy is not about saving others. It's about staying whole in the presence of brokenness. And so the empath silence begins to shift. It's no longer the silence of suppression, but of strength. It's the quiet knowing of someone who can see through illusions, but no longer feels compelled to fix them. Their heart remains soft, but their spirit grows sharp. They no longer take responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to begin with. They still care, but they care consciously, wisely, selectively. The empath who once absorbed everything now learns to let go. The emotional sponge becomes the mirror. Reflecting energy instead of retaining it, their stillness becomes power. Their understanding becomes discernment. And though the world may still come to them for comfort, the empath now stands rooted in their own truth, no longer losing themselves in the name of love. There comes a point in every empath's life when the scales begin to tip, when the weight of carrying other people's pain becomes heavier than their desire to understand it. It doesn't happen in a single moment of defiance. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, as an internal shift. The empath who once felt everything without question begins to question everything they feel. The fog of emotional confusion starts to thin, and through it emerges a realization, this is not all mine. That is the threshold of awakening, the sacred boundary between unconscious compassion and conscious awareness. For so long, the empath's identity has been wrapped around the act of giving. They have lived by an unspoken rule: to love is to endure. They have tolerated the intolerable, forgiven the unforgivable, and rationalized the irrational, all in the name of understanding. Their heart has been both sanctuary and battlefield, absorbing wounds from others as if healing them were their divine assignment. They believed that love could fix what consciousness refused to face. But as the years of silent endurance accumulate, the empath begins to feel a strange emptiness, a kind of spiritual fatigue that even sleep cannot cure. The awakening begins in this exhaustion. It's not born from rebellion, but from depletion. The empath begins to notice patterns, how they always seem to attract those who take but rarely give, those who admire their light yet secretly envy it, those who speak of love but live through control, they begin to sense the invisible cords that tether their energy to those who drain it. For the first time, they start to see that compassion without discernment is a doorway to self-erasure. This recognition hurts deeply because it forces them to confront a painful truth. Much of what they called love was actually self-abandonment. At this threshold, the empath's perception sharpens. The same sensitivity that once made them vulnerable now becomes a tool for awareness. They start to observe energy rather than drown in it. They begin to hear the subtle lies hidden in compliments, the manipulations wrapped in pity, the neediness disguised as love. They see how easily they have been conditioned to soothe the very people who cause their pain. The illusion begins to crack, not because they stop feeling, but because they start seeing. The empath realizes that their empathy was never meant to be servitude. It was meant to be wisdom. They were not born to absorb everyone's wounds, but to understand the nature of wounding itself. In this understanding, the empath begins to separate what belongs to them and what does not. Every emotion, every thought, every pain is examined under a new light. Is this mine? Becomes the question that guards their energy. This simple act of awareness dismantles years of unconscious programming. The threshold of awakening is not peaceful. It is raw, confusing, and disorienting. It feels like shedding a skin that once felt safe but has become suffocating. The empath starts to experience guilt for pulling back, fear for setting boundaries, and sadness for realizing how many connections were built on one-sided giving. They mourn the illusion of love that kept them chained to the very pain they tried to heal. They begin to understand that not everyone who seeks light wants to grow in it. Some only wish to feed on it. And yet, beneath the grief, a quiet strength begins to emerge. The empath starts to feel their own energy again, pure, unfiltered, alive. The silence that once symbolized suppression now begins to feel sacred. Solitude, which once felt lonely, becomes nourishment. They start to find beauty in detachment, not as coldness, but as clarity. They realize that boundaries are not walls. They are the framework of self-respect. The threshold of awakening demands that the empath confront the illusion of control. They begin to see how their constant rescuing of others was also a form of fear. The fear of being unloved if they stopped giving, the fear of being rejected if they said no. The awakening strips away this fear and replaces it with truth. Love that requires self-destruction is not love at all. The empath learns to let discomfort exist without immediately rushing to fix it. They learn to let others face their own shadows without absorbing them. They learn to let silence speak louder than explanations. In this space, the empath discovers something extraordinary: the power of neutrality. No longer caught between the extremes of pleasing and resisting, they find a center within themselves. A calm, grounded awareness begins to replace the old emotional turbulence. They no longer take every energy personally, they simply observe it. What once triggered them now teaches them. What once drained them now defines their boundary, but this threshold also tests their courage. As they awaken, the empath begins to lose people. Relationships built on dependency start to crumble. The narcissist grows restless, sensing that their emotional control is slipping away. The manipulator feels exposed, realizing that their usual tactics no longer provoke reaction. The empath's silence becomes unsettling to those who once thrived on their responses. This silence is not withdrawal, it's liberation. It is the empath stepping out of the emotional labyrinth they were trapped in, finally walking toward their own light. Through this awakening, the empath begins to reclaim their power piece by piece. They rediscover their own needs, their own desires, their own voice. They start to see empathy not as a burden, but as a gift that must first be applied inward. They learn that compassion without self-awareness breeds cycles of suffering. The more they understand this, the more they detach from those who use their kindness as a weapon. Their empathy evolves from emotional submission to spiritual intelligence. The threshold of awakening is the most sacred point in an empath's journey. It's where pain turns into perception, where exhaustion becomes clarity, and where endurance transforms into strength. The empath who crosses this threshold is no longer the same. They no longer seek validation through giving, nor do they mistake connection for captivity. They begin to live not as emotional sponges, but as conscious mirrors, reflecting truth without losing themselves in it. And as this awareness deepens, they realize that awakening is not about becoming less emotional. It's about becoming more authentic. It's about learning that true empathy is not about absorbing the world's pain, but about holding presence in the midst of it. There is a sacred process that begins when the empath finally stops internalizing every wound as their own. It is the moment when they realize that energy is not something to be absorbed, but something to be transformed. This realization marks the beginning of transmutation, the alchemical shift from pain into power, from confusion into clarity, from compassion as weakness into compassion as wisdom. It is not a lesson learned in peace, but one forged through years of quiet suffering, emotional overload, and the desperate need to find meaning in the chaos that once consumed them. For most of their lives, the empath's energy has flowed outward like an open current. They have been the emotional filters of every environment they enter, unconsciously absorbing dense vibrations and converting them into calm. They have taken other people's anger and softened it into understanding, taken resentment and turned it into forgiveness, taken rejection and turned it into self-blame. This act of constant transformation has always been part of their nature, but it has been unconscious. They were doing alchemy without realizing it, bleeding their own light to neutralize the shadows around them. But there comes a point where the empath's energy begins to run dry. No amount of kindness feels fulfilling. No amount of giving seems to restore balance. Their intuition grows heavy, burdened by the emotional toxins they've collected. What once felt like empathy begins to feel like exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, the empath reaches a breaking point, a stillness, where they are forced to look inward and ask the most important question of all: where is my energy going? It's in this questioning that the transmutation begins. The empath starts to see that every emotion, anger, grief, love, jealousy, fear, is simply energy vibrating at different frequencies. Nothing is inherently good or bad. It is the way the energy is directed that gives it meaning. They begin to understand that the pain they've been carrying is not meant to be suppressed or absorbed. It's meant to be transformed. The energy of pain, when held consciously, becomes insight. The energy of anger, when embraced without judgment, becomes fuel for boundaries. The energy of heartbreak, when accepted without resistance, becomes compassion rooted in strength instead of naivety. The empath begins to experience themselves not as a victim of emotional forces, but as a channel through which energy moves and evolves. Instead of drowning in emotions, they start to observe them with awareness. They no longer react, they respond. They no longer cling, they release. Each emotion that once overpowered them now becomes raw material for transformation. They start to sense that their sensitivity is not a curse, but a sacred technology for evolution. In this phase of transmutation, solitude becomes essential. The empath withdraws, not to escape, but to recalibrate. They begin to notice how silence amplifies their awareness, how stillness sharpens their intuition, how absence reveals the presence of their own energy field. They start cleansing not just their physical surroundings, but their emotional and energetic space. Old attachments fall away naturally, not through anger, but through understanding. The empath begins to feel the subtle difference between what expands them and what contracts them, between what nourishes their light and what dims it. As the process deepens, the empath starts to work with their emotions consciously. When pain arises, they no longer suppress it or hand it away through people pleasing. They sit with it, breathe into it, and allow it to teach them. The emotion reveals its true form, a message, not a punishment. They realize that every experience they've endured was energy calling for transformation. The betrayal that once shattered them becomes the catalyst for discernment. The heartbreak that once weakened them becomes the seed of self-love. The silence that once frightened them becomes the womb of strength. This alchemy of energy transforms the empath's entire perception of life. They begin to understand that every interaction is an exchange of frequency. Words are vibrations, intentions are currents, emotions are fields of resonance. They start to navigate life as an energetic being, choosing where to invest and where to withdraw. They begin to align their vibration with truth rather than approval. And as they do, their outer world begins to change. The relationships that once drained them dissolve, replaced by connections that respect equilibrium. The chaos that once surrounded them loses its power because chaos cannot survive in the presence of consciousness. The empath becomes aware of the laws of energy. What they give attention to grows, what they withhold energy from dissolves. They learn to redirect their focus inward, cultivating emotional balance as a form of self-mastery. They begin to see that boundaries are not walls, but energetic filters that preserve harmony. They learn that forgiveness is not about letting someone off the hook. It's about releasing the emotional charge that keeps them tied to suffering. Every lesson becomes a recalibration of frequency, a refinement of power. As this transmutation continues, the empath's energy takes on a new quality. It becomes calm, radiant, magnetic. They no longer give from depletion, they give from overflow. Their compassion no longer leaks, it radiates. Their intuition no longer overwhelms them, it guides them. Their presence itself becomes medicine, not because they absorb others' pain, but because they embody balance. People feel different around them. Not because the empath heals them, but because they awaken something within themselves. The empath learns to hold paradoxes, to feel deeply without drowning, to love without attachment, to forgive without forgetting. They become the bridge between shadow and light, understanding that both are necessary for wholeness. They stop resisting darkness and begin integrating it. In this integration, they reclaim every fragmented part of themselves that was lost through giving. They begin to feel complete, not because life becomes easier, but because they no longer resist its flow. Through this inner transformation, the empath steps into their authentic power, the power that was always there, but hidden beneath layers of emotional entanglement. This power is not loud or forceful. It is subtle, stable, and grounded. It is the kind of strength that comes from inner alignment, from being in tune with the deeper intelligence that governs all energy. The empath realizes that energy cannot be destroyed or escaped. It can only be transmuted. And when held with consciousness, even the darkest energy can become light. Every manipulative dynamic, every illusion of dominance, every emotional game that thrives in silence depends on one thing: the compliance of the empath. The narcissist's control is never real power, it is borrowed energy. It survives only as long as the empath believes the performance, plays the role, and feeds the illusion. When the empath begins to awaken, the entire architecture of manipulation starts to shake. What the narcissist calls strength is revealed as dependency, and what the empath once mistook for love is unmasked as control. The collapse of narcissistic power begins not with confrontation, but with awareness. For so long, the empath has been the emotional anchor in the narcissist's storm. They have been the steady ground that absorbs chaos, the soft voice that diffuses rage, the mirror that reflects back the image the narcissist wants to see. This is how the dynamic sustains itself. The narcissist feeds on admiration, validation, and emotional supply, while the empath unconsciously provides it, mistaking the constant effort for emotional connection. The empath's empathy becomes the fuel that keeps the illusion alive. But illusions can only survive as long as no one questions them. The first crack appears when the empath stops reacting. Narcissistic control thrives on reaction: attention, defense, confusion, guilt, apology. Every emotional response is energy, and energy is the narcissist's sustenance. They provoke not because they seek truth, but because they seek charge. They manipulate not to connect, but to feed. So when the empath begins to detach, to stop explaining, to stop over-giving, to stop absorbing, the narcissist feels something unfamiliar: emptiness. The supply weakens. The mask begins to slip. At first, the narcissist grows louder. They accuse, they twist narratives, they use emotional bait to pull the empath back into the game. They'll feign vulnerability one moment and launch attacks the next. The empath, once so easily swayed by guilt or compassion, begins to see the pattern. They notice the predictability beneath the chaos, the manipulation disguised as love, the emotional cycles that always end in depletion. The realization is painful, but it is also liberating. The empath starts to understand that they were never in a relationship. They were in a system of extraction. As awareness deepens, the empath begins to pull back, not only physically, but energetically. They stop giving explanations that will be twisted, stop seeking understanding from someone invested in confusion, stop trying to soothe the unsoothable. This energetic withdrawal is the true beginning of collapse. The narcissist feels it instantly. The energy that once centered them begins to disappear, leaving them face to face with the void they have spent their life avoiding. For the narcissist, the empath's detachment is not rejection. It is annihilation. Without a source of emotional reflection, their carefully constructed identity begins to fracture. Control was never about love, it was about dependence. The narcissist depends on being seen through the lens of others because their own inner world is empty. They survive through perception management, keeping others entranced, indebted, and emotionally reactive. When the empath withdraws that lens, the narcissist is forced to confront the truth. They cannot tolerate their power was an illusion. What they called love was control. What they called strength was manipulation. What they called superiority was fear. The collapse manifests in stages. First comes anger, rage at losing control, at being unseen, at being denied the reaction they crave. They will attack, belittle, and project, trying to provoke the empath into re-engagement. When that fails, they shift into pity, stories of pain, promises of change, desperate appeals to empathy. When that too fails, silence sets in, not as peace, but as panic. The narcissist cannot process absence. They need noise to validate their existence. The empath's silence becomes unbearable because it mirrors the narcissist's own emptiness back to them. For the empath, this stage is both empowering and difficult. They see the collapse happening, but they must resist the urge to rescue. The old instinct to comfort, to explain, to ease the discomfort still lingers. But now awareness holds them steady. They begin to understand that saving the narcissist would mean sacrificing themselves again. They see that the narcissist's pain is not their responsibility, that their downfall is the inevitable consequence of losing their supply of control. The empath learns that compassion does not require participation. As the collapse deepens, the narcissist scrambles to reconstruct control elsewhere. They may seek new sources of validation, new people to mirror their false image. Yet the pattern follows them. Every new connection begins to fracture faster because the energy that once sustained their illusion has weakened. Without the empath's depth of feeling, their manipulation loses its charm. Their charisma feels hollow, their confidence brittle, their presence unstable. The narcissist is exposed, not to the world, but to themselves. Meanwhile, the empath continues to reclaim energy that was once siphoned away. They begin to notice that their body feels lighter, their mind clear, the emotional fog lifts, replaced by quiet discernment. They start to trust their intuition again, the same intuition that once warned them, but was drowned out by emotional conditioning. Each boundary they uphold strengthens their energy field, and each act of detachment weakens the narcissist's influence further. What was once a power imbalance now reverses, not through domination, but through disconnection. The collapse of narcissistic control is not a dramatic explosion, it is a slow unraveling. It happens in silence, in the space where the empath no longer reacts. It happens in every unanswered message, every emotion left unabsorbed, every manipulation met with calm observation. The narcissist cannot fight silence, they can only project into it. And when their projection no longer lands, when the empath no longer dances to their emotional cues, their sense of control disintegrates. In this collapse, the narcissist faces the truth they've avoided all along. Their control never came from dominance, it came from the empath's willingness to participate. When that willingness ends, the illusion ends. The empath's awareness becomes the quiet force that dismantles the structure of deceit. The narcissist is left with the reflection they've always run from, the emptiness beneath the performance, the loneliness beneath the superiority, the fear beneath the manipulation. The collapse is not revenge, it is revelation. It is the natural consequence of imbalance correcting itself. It is the moment when false power is replaced by truth, when the mirror stops reflecting fantasy and begins reflecting reality. And in that reflection, Everything built on illusion begins to crumble. After the empath's exhaustion, after the collapse of illusion, after the storm of awakening has passed, something begins to stir within, a quiet, grounded awareness that does not shout or seek approval. It rises not as fire, but as light. It is the birth of self-awareness, the reclaiming of power that was never truly lost, only misplaced in the endless act of giving. This is the rise of the self-aware soul, the moment when consciousness takes the place of chaos, when love becomes rooted in wisdom, and when empathy transforms from sacrifice into sovereignty. The self-aware soul is not born through comfort, but through confrontation, with pain, with shadow, with truth. The empath who once lived by emotional instinct begins to live by inner alignment. They have seen too much to remain asleep and felt too deeply to live unconsciously. The same sensitivity that once enslaved them now becomes their greatest strength. It allows them to read not just emotions, but patterns, not just intentions, but energy itself. Awareness becomes their compass. They no longer ask, "Why does this happen to me?" But instead, "What is this teaching me about myself?" This shift is subtle yet profound. The self-aware soul no longer seeks love as validation, it seeks connection as reflection. They understand that every encounter, even the painful ones, was part of their awakening. Each manipulator taught them discernment. Each rejection taught them self-value. Each heartbreak shattered illusions that needed to die. Through suffering, they have refined perception. Through endurance, they have developed strength. Through silence, they have found truth. The self-aware soul does not resent the past, it integrates it. Awareness begins to dissolve identification with roles. The empath no longer defines themselves by how much they give, how much they endure, or how much they are needed. They begin to feel the subtle difference between compassion and codependency, between love and attachment, between empathy and enmeshment. Their identity shifts from "I am what I do for others" to "I am consciousness experiencing itself through love, boundaries, and balance." This inner redefinition marks the true emancipation from emotional servitude. As awareness expands, the self-aware soul begins to observe the inner landscape with precision. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, all are seen, but none are blindly followed. The mind becomes a tool rather than a tyrant. Emotions, once overwhelming, become signals rather than storms. The empath, who once drowned in feeling, now learns to surf the waves of emotion with grace. They understand that energy can be felt without being owned. They start to master presence, the art of being fully here without being consumed by what is here. In this awakened state, boundaries become sacred. The self-aware soul understands that love without boundaries is chaos disguised as care. They no longer feel guilty for saying no, for walking away, for protecting their peace. They know that maintaining their inner harmony is the highest form of service they can offer the world. Their boundaries are not defenses born of fear. They are expressions of self-respect. They no longer chase people who misunderstand their silence or misinterpret their peace. They know that not everyone can meet them where they have evolved. The rise of self-awareness brings with it a new kind of compassion. It is no longer rooted in the need to fix or to save, but in the understanding that every soul must walk its own path. The self-aware empath stops trying to heal those who refuse to heal themselves. Instead, they become a mirror, reflecting truth, not absorbing pain. Their presence begins to awaken others simply through alignment, not effort. They realize that the most powerful healing does not come from intervention, but from embodiment. When they stand in their truth, they give others permission to do the same. Solitude, once a refuge of escape, becomes a temple of clarity. In silence, they commune with their own energy and learn to distinguish it from the noise of others. They begin to trust their intuition without second guessing, to follow inner guidance rather than external validation. Every moment of solitude deepens their connection to the authentic self, the part that existed before conditioning, before people pleasing, before emotional survival. The self-aware soul learns that aloneness is not loneliness, it is unity with the self. The external world begins to mirror this internal transformation. Where once they attracted chaos, they now attract peace. Where once they tolerated manipulation, they now command respect without force. Their relationships evolve from dependency to reciprocity. They no longer enter dynamics to prove their worth. They enter them to share their wholeness. Even when others project or misunderstand, they remain grounded, knowing that perception belongs to the perceiver. The self-aware soul no longer reacts. They respond with consciousness, with choice, with presence. This rise is not about perfection, it is about integration. The self-aware empath no longer rejects their shadow or denies their sensitivity. They embrace both as sacred aspects of their humanity. They understand that true strength is not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. They no longer fear vulnerability because they know it is not weakness, it is truth in motion. They no longer seek to escape pain because they understand pain as transformation. The very emotions that once enslaved them now serve as messengers of growth. Awareness expands even further when the self-aware soul begins to see the interconnectedness of all energy. They recognize that what they heal within themselves ripples outward into the collective. Their personal awakening contributes to humanity's awakening. Every boundary they hold teaches others where self-respect begins. Every act of authenticity weakens the structure of illusion in the world. They start to see life as a dance of energy, a continuous exchange between consciousness and creation. And yet, the self-aware soul moves through the world with humility. They no longer need to prove, argue, or convince. They no longer seek to be understood because they understand themselves. Their power is quiet but undeniable, a still flame that cannot be extinguished by external storms. They have transcended the need to control, to please, to belong. They belong everywhere because they belong to themselves. The rise of the self-aware soul is not a grand declaration. It is a state of being. It is the soul that once broke under the weight of empathy, now standing in balance between heart and wisdom. It is the realization that love without awareness binds, while love with awareness liberates. It is the shift from emotional servitude to spiritual sovereignty, from reaction to response, from confusion to clarity, from being lost in others to being found in the self.